Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce the moderator for our next panel, Geoff Nunn. Geoff Nunn is the curator for space history at the Museum of Flight. He has a master's degree in museology from the University of Washington and over a decade's worth of experience in science and technology museums as an educator and an exhibit developer. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Geoff. Thank you.
All right, thank you, and thank you for everyone who has come out after lunch. Hopefully we'll have a good discussion and a little bit of a scintillating conversation. So on Tuesday at the conference, we heard Eric Fisher in his opening keynote talked about a need for a more seamless way of working within the NewSpace ecosystem. And this panel, Telling the NewSpace Story, seeks to expand on that and see how we can more seamlessly then reach beyond the bubble of that NewSpace ecosystem to connect with the general public. And this is something that we at the Museum of Flight have been trying to engage with for quite some time, beginning with the retirement of the space shuttle in 2011. When we found out that we had not yet received one of or we were not going to receive one of the space shuttles, it actually opened up an opportunity to engage in a more creative way with the broader space story. And we began to see visitors come into the museum after the shuttle retired and say, oh, it's such a shame we're not going to space anymore. And so now, since last week it was just announced that NASA has reopened, it's an excellent opportunity to begin talking about how we tell that new space story. So there are two basic goals for this panel. First, to talk about how do we more effectively engage the general public with this story. And then second, is how do we ensure that the history that is being made now by the new space industry is available 50, 100 years from now so that we have a record of this very important time in space history. And so in order to help me out with this discussion, we have an excellent panel of space now communicators and of corporate and technological historians. So I will let them each introduce themselves and if they want to say a few words. So Sarah?
I'm going to keep it short. Thank you for all of you who turned out as well. So my name's Sarah Cruddas. My background's actually academically in astrophysics, but I work on TV in the UK covering space, particularly commercial space. And then I speak globally about why new space matters and how it's shaping the world. I write books about commercial space and probably some other stuff that I've forgotten as well, but that's it in brief. But my role basically is to inspire people about why this new space race matters, and not just investors, but the people on the street, because we're a planet of 6-7 billion people, 100 billion humans have existed, yet fewer than 600 have gone to space. We are living in a space age at the moment, but if we're going to get to that point where we're really on board with it, we have to explain how space is shaping our lives to everyone, even people who might not necessarily have the right education or the right background. So my role within TV in the UK is certainly to inspire people about why all the work you're doing matters so much and how it's shaping every person's life.
Hi, I'm Mike Lombardi. I'm the corporate historian for the Boeing company, and I'm an airplane guy, so I don't know what. No, I'm just kidding. So I take care of the corporate archives of the Boeing company and all of these major corporations that have joined Boeing: McDonnell Douglas, North American Aviation, and Hughes Aircraft. So when you think about it, all of the corporations throughout our history that have built the vehicles that have taken the majority of, almost all of our astronauts, all of our NASA astronauts to space, are now part of the Boeing company. So I have a little bit of experience capturing that history. I have a lot of the frustration of capturing that history or not capturing it, so I'm glad to share that. But I think it's an interesting perspective coming from the aviation world, in that I look at what's going on today. Right now, this is an important moment in history, in human history. We are becoming a spacefaring race. And I look back at the 1920s, when the United States government handed over flying the mail, 1925 Airmail Act. That was a very important moment in history that changed the way we travel. From that moment, entrepreneurs took over the airplane and its utility and turned it into the airline infrastructure that we enjoy today, that many of you use to get here. And that was a direct result of entrepreneurs, a lot like you see today. Those entrepreneurs made that happen. And that's why I think I'm really confident that we are seeing that moment in history right now, because we have that entrepreneurial spirit. We have those people who have the means. Jeff Bezos, for example, has the means and the passion to do this, and that's why it's going to happen. So, thank you.
I'm Alan Boyle. I'm aerospace and science editor for GeekWire, and before joining GeekWire a few years ago, I did pretty much the same thing for NBCnews.com and MSNBC. And I remember some of those moments from when commercial space was still a gleam in Peter Diamandis's eyes, and Peter coming in to the MSNBC offices, and he had this idea about a Visa credit card that was going to help the X Prize get the money for their prize purse, and kind of watched that whole process unfold. And there are certainly a lot of stories to tell. I'm not sure that we as journalists have gotten to tell all those stories yet, because there's kind of a shroud, with commercial activities. People want to keep some things a little bit behind the curtain so that competitors don't know, or so that they have a little more free way to go in the direction that they're going, or not go. There are a lot of stories about companies that had great aspirations but ended up going nowhere. So that's all part of the history, and we're trying to tell some of it as journalists on a daily basis, but I'm sure it's just the tip of the iceberg, and so I'm looking forward to all the ideas that we're going to generate and that you're going to generate as well, to have that legacy live on in the annals of history.
First of all, I want to thank Geoff for putting this panel together, and also Alan for the perfect setup, because it's hard to tell the story when you actually don't have the resources, the archive to back some of that story up. My name's Erik Rao. I'm kind of the odd person up here, but I am by definition, I guess. I'm the director of Hagley Library, and as my staff will be the first ones to tell you, that doesn't mean I'm a librarian. I'm a PhD historian. Probably, I think, the most interesting for people in this room is I was the AHA NASA space or fellow in aerospace history a number of longer ago than I'd care to admit. Then I taught at Drexel University History of Technology, which is my subfield, for a number of years, and then for 14 years, and then took on the directorship at Hagley. Hagley is actually a museum and a library. I run the library operation, and well, what is that? We collect the records of commerce in America, essentially. We've got thousands of business archives in our collections, everything from Avon to Unisys. I didn't quite get to Z. But and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers. We've got businesses, trade associations, entrepreneurs, and inventors. We tell the story of America's experience with commerce and with entrepreneurship. And so one of the things that marks us, I think, apart is that we deal with deposits. And what the hell does that mean? What it means is that we will take on collections on permanent loan, because some of our clients, and we do have clients, like Avon, like Energy Transfer Partners, like the National Association of Manufacturers, don't want to let go of their stuff, understandably. They still want to have some control of their heritage. And so what we've done is, it's a quid pro quo. They want a service. They want to have their past accessible to their own staffs, to their marketing departments, to be able to tell their stories more effectively to their audiences. We want an archive. to share with historical researchers. And that's where the deal gets born. And those kind of deposits make it possible for us to have these great collections. We're the most important repository for business history in the world for American business, technology and industrial design. And it's that kind of quirk of dealing with depositors, I think, makes us an attractive option for people who are trying to think of, well, what do I do with my heritage, which is now sitting in file cabinets? How do I convert that into something that my marketing department or my communications department might find useful? So.
All right. Thank you, Eric, to all of our panelists here. Eric, before we dive into the greater conversation, so this panel came about in part as a follow-up to a conference that happened last March at the American Institute for Physics in College Park, Maryland, called To Boldly Preserve. And that's Eric was there. And can you summarize a little bit about that conference? Because it directly relates to what's going on here with NewSpace.
Yeah, To Boldly Preserve, I love the title, right? And it grew up as an idea amongst a few of us on a steering committee led by Jonathan Cooper Smith at Texas A&M. And there's general concern in that historical community that the history of this latest addition to the space age, that story is never going to get told. Why? Because nobody's collecting it. It's not being preserved. And so one could have, in the 1970s, 1980s, kind of relied on NASA to preserve all this. You go to the National Archives, you can see, at least on the government side of things, how things worked out, but not the corporate side, of course. But as corporate involvement becomes predominant, unless folks are thinking about preserving the past, that's not really what you do, right? That past is at risk. And so a grant was written from the NSF. We got together in College Park, and it was, for the most part, historians, archivists, librarians. There are folks from NASA History's office and also for its field offices. Geoff was there. I was there. There were folks there from the Computer History Museum in San Jose. Who else was there, Geoff? Do you remember from the Winthrop Group, which is a private archival services for-profit group? And the idea was really to have a conversation starter, well, with you. But not enough of you showed up, and so, but it was still a very good exercise because it got everybody in the room to talk about capabilities. What can we actually do to preserve, especially in the age where, in fact, decisions aren't made on paper anymore; they're being made in digital formats. And how do you make sure that you can open up that document 50 years from now, right? Anybody remember WordPerfect? Okay, yeah, all right. Tried to open one of those files lately? So that's what we call digital preservation, making sure that that file will open so that somebody can see what the contents are. Because, I've collected dead .com records. And I can tell you that .coms in that .com revolution up until 2000, there's still a lot of paper, a lot of research value in the paper. You get past 2000, and it's all non-disclosure agreements. It's all accounts receivable. It's all stuff that isn't really of research value anymore for historians, and also for communicators and so forth. So it's all in the digital at this point, and we have to be mindful of that. So after kind of taking stock of these capabilities of the people in the room, now the onus is on us to make better connections with you.
Yeah, and so we decided to take the show on the road. Now let's dive back into the present. And my first question for all of you actually originated with something that Sarah said.
I gave you the question then.
Yeah, you gave me the question early on, but now I'd like to hear some answers from all of you. You mentioned that how do we make NewSpace relevant to a housewife in Arkansas? And so my question to the panel is, is it necessary to make NewSpace relevant to a housewife in Arkansas? And B, if so, why? And how do we do that?
Or it could be a house husband. You have to remember.
Or a house husband, yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Because space matters, because at the end of the day, I think most people at this conference are here because they want to make money, and that's fine. But at some point, and I think with my panel yesterday, you get people investing in space when it might not be the best deal because they want to be part of space, because they were the generation who grew up with Apollo or with the space shuttle, and they were inspired by space. And I think, at the end of the day, we know so little about why we exist, where we come from, what is out there in the universe. There's so many fundamental questions which relate back to space and can inspire everyone on this earth. And often we get caught up in our everyday lives. And NewSpace is just the next step. It's the Mayflower moment in terms of pushing out and exploring into the solar system. We had the Columbus moment, that was the moon landings, and now we're in this Mayflower moment. And I think the more people which understand the value which can come from exploring space, and how, we all live in a space age already. We've all got cell phones in our pockets, and that's a space receiver in our pocket. And maybe it won't, a lot of my work I do is not just to work to inspire children, it's to inspire adults as well, because maybe they won't become scientists or engineers, but it's about giving them an awareness, and you don't know how they're going to go back to their community and the stories they will tell and how that will inspire other people. So I think in order to actually show how it matters to a house husband in Arkansas, you have to, I'm glad some of you are laughing still, you just have to relate it back to people, because I think so many people just go about their everyday lives not realising how space affects their life. But if you just, at one point, every one of us living on this earth and every person who's ever existed has looked up. So you've got that simple curiosity. As humans, we're curious. Gene Cernan, the last man on the moon, he was quoted as saying, curiosity is the essence of human existence. And often we get sidetracked in everyday life. So it's just about sparking that curiosity. And something like the SpaceX Falcon Heavy launch, it was probably the modern equivalent, not so much an Apollo moment, but it just sparked the curiosity of the media, the layperson, people who have no passing interest in space, to say, wow, there's a car in space and this is happening. And it's just, yes, I can understand it seems like a gimmick to some, but the more people we inspire about why space matters, things which might seem gimmicky, the more people who are going to get on board with this industry. And then who knows what's going to happen when you get more people inspired by space and more people who want to contribute through new ideas. And they might not even become space people, they might become doctors or engineers on other projects. So it benefits society the more people we can inspire.
Thank you. Anyone else care to add?
Well, I think, it's to make people interested. I think it's all storytelling, and like you're talking about, that when I do my history of Boeing for different groups, I finish it with, I put up a slide of the NASA journey to Mars, and I just make that exclamation: we're going to Mars. I mean, it's a declarative statement. We are going to Mars. And I follow it up with, we are on the cusp of being a spacefaring race. Within the next 10 years, people are going to travel on a regular basis to orbit. You can, right now, if you have an extra $1 million, you can make a reservation to stay in a hotel in orbit. And I recommend that when you fly to orbit, that you should fly on the Boeing Starliner, and wear
any reason?
and wear that wonderful Boeing blue spacesuit with the Nike shoes, which you can buy now. I think just
I'm ready.
Are you? I want some too. But I think if you put it that way, then it's all of a sudden it's like, wow, this is happening. I've been asleep. I mean, you don't see it in the news, but it's there. And so I think if you communicate it that way, I think that you can get people excited about it. And I think this is a great moment. We're looking for ways to inspire, in our industry, we're looking for ways to inspire young people to get into engineering. And for me and people in my generation, I was a little guy during Apollo, and that changed my life. From that moment, seeing Neil Armstrong step onto the moon, I was going to be an astronaut. And I didn't quite make it, but that inspired me and everybody else in my generation. And that's another big part of this, is that we're at a moment now where we're going to be able to use this to inspire that next generation and start that cycle again, and even in a bigger way.
Great. I'm thinking about that house husband in Arkansas, and I think that there are several concentric circles, and some of those circles don't necessarily need to include the house husband. For example, if you're a Wall Street Journal subscriber, or if you're subscribing to Space News, you are really interested in the business and the inner workings of the system, and so you're going to be wanting to know all the twists and turns that really the general public might not be so interested in, but that's okay. You've got a niche, and that you want to know everything about that niche, perhaps because it's your business, or perhaps that's your background. Maybe you're an engineer, and you want to know about that just because you are a super space geek, and so that's okay. And then there are the people who, I write for at GeekWire. They're just generally interested in tech. Maybe they work at Microsoft or Amazon, and they don't really have all that much to do with the space effort or commercial space, but they're just naturally interested in what's going on in this cool tech frontier. And maybe they even drive a Tesla car, and so they want to know everything that Elon Musk is up to. And so that. And the booster option, yeah, there you go. But I mean, the personalities we were talking about, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Richard Branson and all these folks who are colorful people, as well as very rich people who are able to follow their space dreams because they've been into this since the Apollo days. So that's another hook to get people interested in it. And then there's the broader interest that Sarah was talking about, just the wonder of being on the frontier and thinking that maybe these technologies and these adventures that people have seen in Star Wars and Star Trek films for a generation, maybe we're getting closer to that time. And so I think that's where the house husband from Arkansas comes in. And there's another hook as well. For example, we had Boeing Horizon X invest in Matternet, the drone company, a couple of days ago. And you could bring that home. I mean, this is something that might really bring drones into the mainstream. Matternet has this Matternet station where you kind of bring your package in and you put it in a slot just as if you're putting it in a mailbox, and then everything is automated from there, and the drone takes it off and takes it to its pre-programmed destination autonomously. And so if you can bring that home, it's kind of like the next iPhone, that we'll be seeing technologies that you're actually going to be using, and I think the house husband is going to be interested in that as well.
No,
well,
I'm
yeah.
sorry.
So don't. I would like to nominate.
Diversity
So
matters.
the house husband is officially this conference's Joe the plumber, to bring back some old political
But it's
discourse.
about how the average Joe.
Absolutely.
Well, how many people here are communicators for their outfits? A few of you? Okay, so you spend a lot of time crafting your message for particular audiences, right? I mean, one audience that we haven't been talking about up here is your own associates. And when you're a startup, that's relatively easy because you've got your own worker culture, your small staff, et cetera. But if you grow, or if you've merged, and I've heard discussions about a couple of outfits merging, you want those folks to know what they're part of. So instead of the house husband, I'm thinking about the young engineering graduate, and she's just landed a job at a startup and wants to know what story did she sign on to, We do this all the time. Kind of the earliest collection we took on was DuPont's. And so Dow DuPont has for many, many years sent their worldwide associates to us. And they have, because they want their associates to know where the story began. In our collections, Avon is another big collection that we've got. And they too, they're strong brand focus, but they also want everybody to know what their story is. So, they've got their newsletter, which turned into an employee publication. That's an important audience for you too. And I know that many of you think about that. And it's relatively easy to inculcate people coming in when you're small. When you grow, it gets a little tougher.
Do you have that going on with Boeing? Do you have new employees?
Yeah, thank you. I was going to comment on that. That's one of the things that I do. I give a weekly presentation of our history to as what they call it onboarding now, or employee orientation. And I take they learn about, of course, our mission statement and all these things, but I tie in our culture. And that's, I think, is an important part of what I do for Boeing as historian, is that I'm kind of the keeper of the culture. Obviously, with a company that's 100 years old, something is going right. So what is that, and how do we pass that on? So that's part of what I do, is make sure we pass that on. And I do it through storytelling. I take those epic moments in our history that define who we are, what really speaks to what is Boeing, how is it unique. But I always started out with telling our new employees that you are now part of something amazing, something grand. This is like nothing else in our human experience. What we do at Boeing is not like anything else. We've changed the world, we've made history, and I go on from there. And by the time I'm done telling this story, and again, it's storytelling, I have these young people and new hires coming up to me in tears, saying how excited they are to be part of this, or they never understood this. So I think that's the way to do that. At least for me, it works. Yeah.
But do you think this is the problem with journalists on a panel? We're all going to ask questions now. Do you think that's not changing, though? Because people who are now in their early 20s, they don't want to work for Boeing. They want to set up on their own and have their own startups and disrupt the industry. So how do you retain them?
Right. And you mentioned it too with Horizon X, is that we've had to kind of reframe who we are, or not even reframe that. We had to really reorientate ourselves to our roots, that entrepreneurial spirit, and understanding what that is, and then bringing those new people into that. So we're going out to those startups and those new companies, and we're bringing them into Boeing. We're empowering people to think out of the box, and you'd also be surprised. A lot of young people do what I've been told.
Those young people.
What I've been told is that they do like history. That there is kind of this yearning for. There is a lot of interest in millennials and younger folks now in history, and kind of looking back to a bygone era, kind of as an anchor. There's interest in nostalgia. So things are changing a little bit in that regard. I've seen lately. Yeah.
So let's build on a couple of things that have been brought up. A couple of you mentioned the Falcon Heavy launch and this connection to history. So there was an interesting conversation that happened on Twitter around the Falcon Heavy launch. Emily Lakdawala with the Planetary Society and Phil Plait were kind of conversing about what they perceived as a difference in how the story of that launch was presented by SpaceX versus how NASA might have done something, and it's been brought up with these big personalities that are leading the industry. Someone earlier today mentioned, we like to talk about the democratization of space, but it's really still 2 to 3 nation states and a couple of billionaires who are deciding whether or not we go to space, and so what is different now, and where are there parallels between what we were doing 50 years ago in 1968, which also had a lot of other tumultuous things going on, outside of space and today, and how do we, how do those changes affect how we get people interested in thinking that this story is important?
Well, I think the Apollo age, that was really defined by the Cold War, and there was a lot at stake. The perception that America had to lead in technology in order to have an edge over the Soviet Union, and it really, on one level, it was kind of a life and death for the democratic way. So I don't think that there's that much of that component nowadays.
I think the difference is as well who's paying for it, and I think it was government money before, and now it's private money. And one of the best pieces of advice I got when I started in the media was talent will out, and it's the same thing. So why should you shout about your story when you're paying for it? Wait for them to come for you. So for example, with the SpaceX Falcon Heavy launch, I was the only UK journalist at that launch. I didn't recognise the value in the story until after it happened. But I don't know whether that matters or not, because they're inspiring people in different ways. And then through this whole like Bond villain, as the media sometimes like to call them, Bezos versus Musk, again, it's their own money, and they're not, for example, with Jeff Bezos, he's doing the heavy lifting, he's opening up access to space, not to himself, but to all of you, anyone with an idea. So maybe what we need to do is focus on telling their story better, and journalists working better within an industry, and more STEM literacy, certainly within the media. But it all comes down to who's paying for it, and if it's a private company, they don't have to tell the story in the same way that NASA did.
And can you elaborate on, do you have any specifics on how journalism or journalists can help to tell that story better?
I think we need better, or it depends. It all comes down to the company, because if you're a private company, it's whether you want to tell your story or not. And then it comes to building up better relationships with journalists. So one of the channels I work on in the UK, a guy who was on before me was talking about CERN and so-called quantum philosophy, because he didn't realise it was quantum theory. I'm glad you laughed. So there is this STEM literacy, and in the UK, certainly, you have to have a legal qualification to be a journalist, but you don't have to have any sort of STEM qualification. Our education system specialises at 16, so most people haven't studied maths or science since they were 16 years old. But I think it really comes down to the organisations and the private companies about, A, whether they want to tell their story or not, and B, building better relationships with journalists. But a lot of organisations, I've had some lovely lunches with Boeing. You do a good job. But I think it really does depend on the story you want to tell.
Yeah, I've had some experience with it between, you mentioned the way NASA's doing this, and then the public side of it, or the entrepreneurial side of it. And the story that NASA tells, and that Boeing is supporting that story, is that on the journey to Mars, they are focused on success and safety, and to do that, they're using the model that was used for Apollo. Those very purposeful steps that we're seeing right now. With you're doing the exploration of Mars, and then you have astronauts who are staying up at the ISS for a year to see how humans are going to react to that journey. That 3 years. And so these are the purposeful steps that NASA is taking, and this is how they are going to address it. Where you see the opposite end of that, where it's Elon Musk is, everybody buy a ticket, get in the spaceship, and there's Mars. We'll see ya. I like to use that slide of the S4 that was launched at the moon to make the seismic reading. They crashed that third stage of the Saturn rocket into the moon for a seismic. I use that to show the Elon Musk plan to go to Mars. So that's kind of that difference. But I think again, I said earlier, I think the difference here than what you saw in the 60s and even in the 80s, because if you remember, Ronald Reagan pushed this too. He wanted access to space, to orbit, and there was a lot within the industry. There was a lot of effort behind building new space shuttle, building heavy boost, the trans-atmospheric vehicle program. Of course, a lot of that was to get SDI into orbit, but that was one of the things that Reagan pushed. And at that time, it was still too expensive. Access to orbit was expensive. But now, with the richest man in history that's no longer a problem. All this technology that you see that folks are using, the industry has done this. DCX, we landed boosters already. We've done a lot of these things, but it was never feasible economically to do them. And now and going back to the 1920s, that model of the airline, that's what you're seeing today. Private individuals with the means to do this and with the passion to do it are the ones that are going to make this happen.
I was going to say there are a couple of other really big differences. I was struck when people are talking about Apollo. There's this book called Marketing the Moon, and I would recommend that because back then NASA was really in charge of just marketing the whole space effort and really managed that the way that it was covered. You all hear the stories about the Corvettes that are bought for the astronauts and how the message was massaged back then. Now we've got more players doing this, and of course these players are interested in telling their story the way that they want to tell it, and so you have to be on your guard just as people had to be on their guard back then. Whether maybe back then we bought into the NASA Apollo vision maybe a little bit too much. Maybe should have been a little more self-critical. The other thing is the rise of social media. Now we have Elon Musk basically communicating with the world through Twitter. I don't know how many press releases SpaceX has issued, but not that many compared to the news that has come out of Elon Musk's Twitter account. So that's something to watch too. People are tweeting about this session even now, and one tweeter, Doug Messier, hi Doug, says we really need to be more self-critical about how we cover the space effort. So I'm going to go meta and say, sure, let's be more critical.
Well, and I think to build on that right away, I think it's important. We are also often talk about how space is dangerous, and there have already been lives lost in the NewSpace movement. And so, how should companies approach that very real risk in order for the broader efforts to be able to survive? Are there, while still, maintaining a level of open discourse about and self, awareness about those risks? Any thoughts on ways that industry can kind of gird itself against the real risks of the?
So you mean communicating those, or?
I would say, if and when this happens, how can they prepare? Because I know Boeing, with its long history, has 100% safety record, but has
well, there's a couple things. First, it starts with a culture of safety, and that's one thing. This isn't PR. This is honest truth. Because at Boeing, we realize that if something goes wrong with an airplane, it's pretty dramatic. Even small accidents make the press. And so that's a hit to our reputation. So there's that part of it. But then, the people that work at Boeing, they're just like you. They're everyday people, and they don't want anything to go wrong. They're very conscious of the fact that the work that they do, the airplanes they build, that people are getting on those airplanes, their families are getting on those airplanes, and they know that, they feel that, and they, believe me, they think about that all the time. And so that's a basic part of our culture. One of our chief engineers, the famous, you might know Joe Sutter, the father of the 747, and he said that safety was where they always started in the design of a new airplane. That was the first word, and Joe stayed with the company as a consultant until just about the day he died. And he would go into those meetings with our engineers and product development, and he would say, I don't hear you guys talking about safety right now. And that's it. It's a primary part of our culture. So that's where it starts, is that you try your best to make sure that you have 100% reliability. So, and because of that, flying is safer than walking across the street to get to your mail. And that's a direct result of that culture. Now, on the other side of it, within the communications part of it, if something does go wrong, our communications folks, that's just basic part of communications, is that you have a plan to how you're going to deal with that when something does happen. And the best way to deal with that is to be open and honest. There's no reason to hide anything, and it's just get out there and be honest and get out there as fast as you can. Especially when you're talking about social media, you got to get out there quick. So, that's just part of communications, is that you have a plan to deal with that.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. It comes down to honesty and just having a plan in place as well. But the media, particularly some of the media in the European countries, are biased. They are going to have an agenda at the end of the day, but as long as companies are honest about what they're doing and putting out the correct information, that's the best you can do.
Yeah, it just basically means that you need to know your own story very, very well, and be able to rely on that. Because if you don't get out there with your story quick, somebody else is going to make it for you.
Okay, so I think I've got one more question for the panel, just kind of building on this, and then I'll open it up to the audience for additional questions. Alan, you raised the social media aspect, and this is something that absolutely concerns us as historians with this NewSpace industry. Is we've got a lot of development that's happening in digitally native technologies, and so as the panel as a whole, what do you see as the risks for that historic record implied by digital technology? How do you archive a Slack thread, that sort of thing? And what are some steps that companies might be able to take to make sure that they don't lose that story, knowing your own story 50 or 100 years from now?
Yeah, it's kind of the great irony with lots of great cheap information. It's become so cheap it hasn't become worth saving, it seems. And so the danger with digital formats is that they just fall off the cliff. They aren't preserved. But I often get asked by potential clients, what should we be doing? And am I getting ahead of the conversation?
No, I think this is good.
Yeah, what can we do right now without expending any additional resources that we should be doing? And I've basically made a list for them. You want to make sure that you preserve what your board is talking about in their meeting minutes. You want to know, preserve the correspondence happening in the C-suite. You want some of the materials that is being generated by your departments, R&D, engineering, finance, your publications departments, communications, and so forth. You want to retain your audio and your video, your film, some of the digital formats I've been talking about, but also oftentimes one of the most precious commodities or bits of information, bits of your story that are most volatile are your own people. Because people retire, they move, and oftentimes what they do, what they contribute, doesn't hit paper or doesn't hit a digital document, and it walks out the door. An oral history program sometimes can be done very, very cheaply, and with minimal training, somebody with a microphone can capture a story. And as long as you don't store this stuff in a dank basement or a hot attic, you're in pretty good shape, and you haven't spent hardly anything at that point.
Yeah, I'll second oral history. That is some of the best history, because you get things that aren't written down, and you also get the connective tissue for the things you save. And I think it's really important. The digital world is very difficult, and one of the things that makes it difficult is that digital records are incredibly volatile. Their life expectancy is so short that I think you mentioned earlier about how operating systems and software and versions and how those change, and then all of a sudden you can't read your files. So just having a digital archive is almost worthless too. So you really have to. it really requires planning. You got to have a good collection policy up front that states clearly what those things are that you want to collect, and communicate that with your organization to make sure that everybody is sending you those things. And then you need to have a place where those can be stored, and then you need to have a plan to make sure that you're on top of the preservation. And again, I grew up in a world of paper and film, and it didn't take as long. I mean, those things would last for a while. You had a little bit of time before you had to worry about it. But with digital records, you got to stay on top of it, because sometimes you don't even know they're gone. Yeah.
Mike, are you preserving materials related to Starliner, doing those oral history exercises?
Yeah, I sent a nastygram to the program just the other day saying I haven't heard from him. But yeah, that's in one of the ways. Boeing's a big place, and it's hard. That's one of the things I have to understand, is that I can't take care of everything. So I have what I do is, and this might be helpful for your organizations too, is that I have what I call a history committee. And so I find people who are part of organizations across the company and make them deputy historians. And of course, people love that. They want to be a part of it, and it gauges them into this. But then they're my deputies in those areas, and they ensure that my communication about our history program gets out, and that those artifacts and documents, archival material, is getting back to the archive.
And can we see those? Can mere journalists get access to those archives?
Yeah.
But I was just going to say, it's also about retaining knowledge as well, because you look back at Apollo, we've nearly lost the generation of men and women who put humans on the moon, and we haven't returned. NASA's done a great job of that, but we don't know what's going to happen in the future. So it's about retaining things for business and scientific reasons as much for historical and storytelling reasons.
Right, and that's and you bring up a good point, because we talked about that earlier. There's a lot of apathy about history, and in some corporations they're going to say there's no reason to do that. There's no value in history. So one of the hard jobs I have is selling what I do to the corporation. Sometimes I have leaders who love history, who see the reason for it, but a lot of times you have those bean counters that, there's no value. So what I have to do, what I do for Boeing is my program puts history to work. And we find different ways where history creates value, and that's one of them, is collecting that knowledge and making that available. So we're an engineering company, so we collect with the understanding we have brilliant people that have worked at Boeing, so let's collect their papers and the things they did, and when we have a new engineer come in and they want to start a new program, we start them where that other engineer left off. And it saves so much time and money. So that's one aspect of it. But overall, what I do is show that ways that we can create value and make real money for the company, and that's why I still have a job.
All right, excellent. So let's go ahead and open up to questions from the floor. So, your hands, any questions?
So there's been talk about how there are parallels between NewSpace and the NewSpace story and the railroad story of the 1800s. This is a question for all panelists. Is that a good comparison? And if it is, what are some of the lessons that we can learn from that story and how we tell this story, or other lessons that we might be able to derive from other analogies?
I think there's a million comparisons like that. You compare it to the early days of aviation. You look at the X Prize, where you had the Oteg Prize back in the 1920s, which enabled Lindbergh to cross the Atlantic. You compare with Columbus. You can compare with the elevator in terms of what's happening now with NewSpace. So I think the comparisons are just a good way of telling a story, because actually what's happening in space is nothing different to what's happened on Earth. It's almost the 8th continent, I would say, of the world, but we're off the world now. So I think the reason the comparisons are used is you're taking something so otherworldly and so remote and something that we can't relate to in our everyday lives, and you're making it relatable. So the railroad comparison, that is a hard word to say, railroad comparison is just another example of how we can make something which seems so unrelatable, relatable.
Somebody earlier on another panel talked about, or used the analogy of cathedrals.
That's another one then.
Yeah, I mean we tend to think in terms of analogies with history. It's useful. It's profitable to think about it because you get to see how things are alike or how they're different. I mean, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, right? So you can kind of think about, well, what was important in terms of infrastructure? Was the state involved, and how? And you begin to see what is the same, but then also what is unique in that story and what your contribution is.
Yeah, and I like that more recent example of the airlines because I agree history doesn't repeat itself, but there are those similar events, and when I look back at and I like to compare Bill Boeing with Jeff Bezos because they're both these are men who were they had vision. And they had great entrepreneurial spirit. They were great businessmen. Bill Boeing had his holdings in timber and mining, so he was a wealthy man. And Jeff Bezos has Amazon, and those two things were the fuel for their dream. Both of them had a dream. Bill Boeing's dream was to take the airplane and make it into something useful, and Jeff Bezos' dream is to get us out, and tens of thousands of us living out in space. Millions. That's right, millions. And so I look at that not just as history repeating itself, but just the personality and the wherewithal that they have and their drive. And to me, passion and vision are the key elements to success. And that's why I really think Jeff Bezos is almost like Bill Boeing reincarnated. And that's why I think he's going to succeed.
Hi, thanks for a great set of talks. I was just wondering, you were talking about the storing of knowledge. Obviously, that's kind of a amorphous thing, but also when you're deciding what to archive and what to store, and people's stories, it's also throughout history, people's stories get written out. So how do you kind of decide what's worth collecting, storing, and archiving versus what kind of gets thrown into either the digital data abyss or, how do you make that decision?
Well, that varies from case to case. It's very contextual, but it's something that historians and curators are actually used to doing. And it's something that we have on occasion done. We've gone to trade associations, we've gone to companies, we've basically dumpster dived, and told them, I actually, what I sometimes get is a phone call saying, we've saved this, and this, and we've marked this, and this for destruction. And can you advise, confirm we've made the right choices? And oftentimes it's the opposite. Which the stuff they wanted to save is in fact, well, in part it helps to have a kind of a trusted outside partner in that because you're so close to the story that you don't want to throw anything away sometimes. And it's hard for you to make those decisions. Sometimes somebody needs to come out and say, well, this is going to be useful in telling a larger story about what you're involved with. And this is something that was really interesting for you at this moment, but was not significant in the big scope of things. We have the papers of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was known as kind of the standard railroad of the world in its time. When it shut down, was taken over by Penn Central, there were 2 warehouses in Media, Pennsylvania. There are 400,000 boxes of archives. You know how many came out of there? 8. From 400,000 to 8,000. And we spread it across a couple of libraries.
I thought you were saying 8 boxes.
Not 8 boxes, no, 8,000. So yeah, everybody's like, but yeah, I mean that's the kind of culling that sometimes takes place, and it helps to have a little assistance on the side. And again, there's a number of places that you can get that assistance. We do it. There's for-profit archival companies that do it. Hagley's a 501c3, but like the Winthrop Group or History Associates, History Factory, they'll all provide that service as well.
So are you offering to be the NewSpace archivist?
Well, I'll give you my card.
That's it. Well, and Erik raises a really good point, just really quick. We're not, in being up here and talking about the importance of history, we're not expecting every small startup to go out and hire a full-time historian. Not everyone can afford or find a Mike Lombardi, but it's just to be more conscious, and that's why we're here. We want to help capture that story and help communicate that story, and that's why the cultural community has now engaged in this topic in a thoughtful way. Okay, we have time for one more question.
Hi, I was wondering if you could put a finite, or at least a more finite definition on what we are referring to when we say new space. Has new space begun? Are there particular technologies or legislation that kicked off new space?
Mike, do you have, you're old space, so.
Well, and to me, it's this new element of the entrepreneur, of the private enterprise being involved, and I think that's what, to me, that's what defines it. It's changing from it being purely a government endeavor where you have NASA and the Air Force along with industry working on this, that now you have private individuals and corporations who are launching their own rockets, and I think that, to me, that's what defines this.
Is Boeing new space?
Yes.
And old space.
Yeah, like I said, fly the Starliner. Yeah.
I don't think there's really a pivot point you could take, for example, when there was the first private astronaut to go into space, or when Virgin Galactic was successful with the X Prize. But I think it's been a gradual change. But I think what's enabled new space to be defined now is just an awareness not only within the industry, an awareness within the investment community, and an awareness within the general population. I think something like what SpaceX is doing and how that's captured the public imagination. You can't suddenly say, it's not like with the space race and we had Sputnik and then we knew we were in the space age. It's not as simple as that. We're never going to see another Apollo type era again, but we're seeing something different, and I think it's going to slowly change. But I think in order to define new space, we were talking about this on my other panel yesterday. I mean, is it even new space, or is it space economics? And I think as humans, we like to label things, but maybe we don't. And maybe it's just a shift we're seeing in our history, but it's actually something we've seen throughout history.
Eric, do you have more to?
Let me complicate that. I mean, on the one hand, I like what you and Mike have just said, because the presence of the entrepreneur, the startup, especially the startup firm, involved in this story. But then I also think about, the entrepreneurs can show up in a variety of contexts, and we usually don't think about them as showing up in government bureaucracies, but in fact, they do exist there. When T. Keith Glennon stepped down as director of NASA and the Kennedy administration came in and appointed Jim Webb, I mean, Jim Webb was an entrepreneur. He was a major system builder and may have created an organization that is sometimes difficult to work with, but he basically turned NASA from essentially a science organization into a big space systems organization, which did not exist before.
Yeah, and the new space question is really the billion or trillionaire dollar question, and I'll just use my privilege as moderator to close in referencing the earlier panel today where I believe it was the gentleman from NanoRack said, be careful what you name something because that name will stick. And I think that may actually be part of what's happening with new space. All right, so I'd like everyone to please thank our wonderful panel for coming out today, and thank all of you for sticking around this afternoon.